And what then within Christianity makes, according to Walter Nigg, or you yourself, or perhaps you agree with Nigg on this matter, but what is the essence of monastic life? Because, of course, we're talking about various forms of life, and that's also what in the book is so beautifully written, from the Desert Fathers to the Cenobitics to the people like St. Francis who become wandering monks again, and so on and so on. So there's a whole variety. So what actually unifies them into one specific thing?
I would say, first we have to make a distinction. There's a distinction, a very clear distinction to be made between monasticism and religious life. Nigg is not always very clear on this, to be honest. And it could be his Protestant background that he's failing to see what is actually, at least in the Catholic world, a very major distinction. The contemplative monastic orders are a very distinctive and much more ancient form of the consecrated life than the religious orders. Now, there's some overlap. Okay, the Carmelites are an interesting case, for example. The Carmelites started out as basically a group of hermits in the Holy Land, ended up, for various reasons, mainly the Islamic invasions and the Crusades and whatnot, they end up in places like England and Spain and elsewhere. And because they were, in a sense, they were very much like the Carthusians. It was a group of hermits, basically. And it then becomes, with the influence of the friar movements, Dominicans, Franciscans, they become friars, which means they're much more active in the world. But in reality, the Carmelite order was still very contemplative. So it's a fascinating overlap between the contemplative and the active. Other orders, like the Jesuits, they have a specific mission which Antony the Great would not have recognized at all. He wouldn't have understood even what they're about, basically. And they become, in effect, they become an evangelistic order, an intellectual order, and one that's absolutely dedicated to doing whatever the Pope tells them. So and their spirituality is not monastic. That's the one thing where I think we have to be clear. When you start looking at the exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, you have departed radically away from the monastic style. I'm not going to get into all that, but it's vastly different, and it's somewhat at odds with, say, Basil, Benedict, the classical monastic order. So that's the two halves. And you have to say that, for example, where does Francis fall? Francis is a fascinating case in point because in many ways he's very much like a Basilian monk, in the mode of Basil the Great. You could even call him a fool for Christ's sake in that sort of Russian way. Very much a contemplative and very radically rooted in things like the Sermon on the Mount. That's, for him, that's the only rule that exists is what Christ has to say. Everything else is superfluous. But in that, strangely, very much in accord with, say, someone like Antony the Great. Very, very similar beginnings. Basically leave everything and go off, and both the call of Antony and the call of Francis, that's, at that level, very similar. How they live it out's somewhat different, and because they're just different people, very different characters. But the two halves have to be seen to some extent separately. And so when you're reading Nigg, you're reading a series of biographies, and you're getting a wonderful introduction. However, the big question is, are we talking about monastic charism or religious life charism? And so to get back to your question, I would say probably the most important charism that we should seek to see restored is not so much the religious life. That will always be there because people will always be in the world, and they will always. But the question is, to what extent is the monastic life still relevant in today's world? And that is the life of contemplation, regular prayer and all of that. And I'd say we have two models for that. Both of them very much related to the other, and that is in the East. In the East, there are no monastic orders. Okay, you have monks and you have laity, and there is no difference spiritually or ascetically between the two. A lot of people don't realize this. In Orthodoxy, you do not have that same kind of separation that you have in the West. All of the prayers that, I would say, as a lay person in the Orthodox Church, I was ordained, but in the Orthodox Church, I've decided to be humble and stay put, as a lay person. The prayers I would say each day are prayers that have been greatly influenced by the monastic tradition and Orthodoxy. It just simply is. It's in the air you breathe. What the monk does, he just does more of it, because he's actually dedicated to fostering the depth of spiritual life in the Orthodox Church. So Basil's vision that at the heart of that you have these very dedicated apostolic men who are the ones who end up being the bishops. Your parish priest is usually and intentionally married, because they believe very much that when Paul says, for example, that let the bishop be the husband of one wife, basically to see how does he run his household, because when you look at how he runs his household, you'll know how he'd be able to run the church. So that's a different thing, but they're all still praying the same prayers. The divine liturgy, all of that reflects the influence of monasticism, right down to the very prayers that are prayed. Most of that's been written by monks and given to the church by monks. That's the East, and as you can see, that's a very interesting understanding of monasticism, but it's just commonplace throughout the Eastern world. In the West, what you had was roughly the same thing for a long, long time, right up to the time of Bernard. I'd say where it really begins to change is around the time of Bruno and Bernard. And the only reason it changes is because they want to get back to the original monastic charism. Okay, the world is changing. The West is becoming more scholastic, more rationalistic, and in fact, that's one of the problems I see with the Dominicans and with the Jesuits, is that they became much more rationalistic in their approach to the faith. I don't think there's anything strange in the fact that it's Saint Bernard who gets referred to as the last of the fathers, because basically in the West he is. He's the last. I mean, his great argument with Abelard indicates this. He was very harsh on Abelard, but basically he's right, that Abelard represents something in the West that is unknown to the patristic inheritance of the Church. The East had the same problem, but they decided differently. The West went more with Abelard and left Bernard behind, and so he's the last of the fathers. In the East, there is no last of the fathers. But what you have at the center in the West is basically your Benedictine model. Even the Augustinians are still, in a sense, plugged into that. And what is Benedict doing? Well, at the center of many of the Christian communities in the West, for the longest time, you had these Benedictine monasteries. And again, these were the people that you went to for your spiritual edification. Very often, they would share their goods with the community around them. When you went to confession, you very often would go to a monk. Even in the Middle Ages, you still could go to a lay brother and confess your sins. It was a little bit looser than what happened later on. So you have these models both in East and West. And if I was to say, what do we need to recover today? We probably need to recover. In the East, it's not a problem. In the West, it is a problem. We need to recover something of that sense that at the heart of the Church is a spirituality which is closer to the Benedictine model than to what came along later. from, say, maybe this, from roughly the 15th century on and 14th century on. I don't know if that answers your question at all, but I think it approaches some of the issues I'm trying to get at. That monasticism has a place, but in the West it needs to be not simply to go to what exists already, but to say what was the original dynamism, and once again, how do we recover that, if you will?
Yeah, it's very interesting actually to make that distinction. And you mentioned that Nigg, it's probably his Protestant heritage, where in Protestantism they really got rid of that monastic side. And if you look at it, they never got rid of what you call the religious life. There's plenty of missionary groups and so on, which are very organized and go out into the world in a religious sense. But it's that specific contemplative aspect that got lost.
The key to the West is this. When the Benedictines make a vow, okay, they don't just simply make a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Okay, with the Franciscans and all, it's a point that actually was made recently in a book by called Mysticism, Magic, and Monasticism by Sebastian Morello. And I think he's right on that. I don't always agree with Morello, but I do agree on this point, that the key to the Benedictine life was the vow of stability, stabilitas, where you stay in one place. Okay, that if you remember in the Rule of Benedict, he's very critical of the gyrovags and the others who are wandering around. He wants his monks to, you stay put. Why does he want that? Because it's in stability that those people around you, they need to see. You're stable, you're put, you'll be there for years and years and years, and these people relate to you as a stable presence, not as a rotating priest. The Franciscan priest can come and preach for a few years, and again, he's off, he's gone, he's somewhere else. Dominicans, the same. Jesuits, they're basically holed up in universities anyway, so who cares? But the Benedictine community in the monastic era was a stable presence, and you knew it may be completely corrupt after a while and needs reform, but it was that stability that they exhibited that built up a healthy, and the Middle Ages, despite all the stupid TV dramas and all, which have absolutely no historical awareness whatsoever from what I can say, was a very deeply religious culture. It wasn't always perfect, but it was. And what was at the center of it, very much as in the Eastern Orthodoxy to this day, it's the monastic presence. And that was true. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's...
No.
But I thought that I better say it, yeah.
It links to what I wanted to get to next, which is the vows of stability and of poverty and celibacy and so on. Because when we think about contemplative life should be renewed, certainly in the West, certainly in a Protestant context and also in a Catholic context. But if we talk about the renewal of monastic life, I wonder what it might look like. Will it be exactly the same as what was, but in modern times, as has often happened, or will we see new forms? And I'll also relate this question a bit to once we take a broader interreligious view of monasticism and contemplative life. We see many forms all over the world, but even in Buddhist monasteries, for example, it's much more normal to enter for a couple of years and get out again. In ashrams, there is no vow of stability and so on and so on. It's centered around the guru more than anything else. And when you look at the guru or the sheikhs in Islamic tekkes and so on, they're often married. There's no vow of celibacy and so on. So there's something specific about the monasticism and the contemplative life within Christianity, which makes it really centered around a particular class of people or a particular type of people. And I'm wondering whether that will still hold up in the future. So what do you think? Are we going to see new forms of monasticism which perhaps are local but a bit more flexible in entering and getting out? Or are we going to see more oblates, people who are connected to a monastery but not necessarily themselves monastics? Or do you think it's going to go another way?
I think it can go both ways and side by side. I don't see it being an either or situation. I don't think you can create an entirely new monasticism. I think certainly not in the East. It would almost be impossible and undesirable. I don't think you need it, for one thing. What you will see, and what we are seeing today, I don't want to exaggerate it, but we are seeing a turn towards, say, traditional expressions of Christianity in a much bigger way, and we are seeing the formation of new monasteries. We have seen that in the past few decades. What's interesting is that the vast majority of them tend to be traditional, and by that I don't mean just traditionalist. Okay, we have to make that Yaroslav Pelikan distinction that traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, and tradition is the living faith of the dead. You're not going to escape tradition, nor should you. Tradition is the life of the Spirit in the Church. Does that mean that every form of monastic life needs to, wear robes and pray in Latin or whatever it is? And that, of course, that's not at the heart of it. What is at the heart of it is to return to these the things we've been talking about. This understanding that there is a regula to be followed, there is an ascetical life to be followed, that one needs to have their goals and methods and ways of getting there defined. And for that we have tons and tons of material to work with. Yes, you have to adapt in every age what has gone before, but certainly, say, a collection, again, like the Philokalia is a good example of that, of the monastic, or the conferences of John Cassian, or whatever it is. These monastic resources are still available and are easily adaptable. Benedict's rules, very adaptable to any context. So do we need to reinvent the wheel? The answer to that is no. Will it look different in the future than it has in the past? Well, it looked different in the 11th century than it did in the 4th. So that's a matter of adaptation. Yeah.
In that respect, I do wonder, how do you deal with a certain tension? That's certainly something in my personal life, where when you read books, also like Nigg's book, you get those ideals of those people who have a quite radical life. Most of them, certainly in terms of poverty and celibacy and so on. And that's not something we can all do. So there always remains this tension. You'd like to be like them, but they also always look like people who have a different lifestyle, and that lifestyle seems like the only one capable of getting you as far as you'd like to go yourself. So how do you deal with that tension between the ideal and living normal life as a layperson?
Yeah. In some ways, I think it's a matter of maturity. I think as you get older, you realize when you're young and very zealous and on fire, it's never enough. You always feel that I'm falling way short, and patience with oneself is hard to come by. Or, unfortunately, that sometimes also goes along with a certain amount of arrogance. I have arrived. I've been a Christian for 3 years, and now I'm going to lecture you on how to be a good Christian like me. You get this, and it's even worse when they become converts to Orthodoxy or Catholicism or whatever. They're now going to save the world with what they've discovered. When you get older, as you probably know, you begin to realize that everything is Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Basically, the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. That you're always going to be less than you want to be, and always striving. And let's face it, if you're a Christian, you're always striving for the very highest ideal. You're striving to be like Christ. Well, the promise is you will be, but you may not get there as quickly as you would like. That's the whole point of asceticism. And you're always going to find that you have more things inside of you that you are lurking in the corners of your soul that you didn't really know was there until the light got shined on it. It was back there in the back of the cave, completely unnoticed by you in the shadows, and then you had the torch of the Spirit, if you will, and you shine it, and oh my goodness, what is that horrible thing that's been? I know I smelled something back there, but you know, that becomes the norm of the ascetical life, and that's really what the ascetical life is meant to do. And contemplative life, everybody thinks contemplation is simply to, kind of. I appreciate, say, for example, and I practiced for sometimes Zen practice, and I appreciate all of those things, but as methods only. At some point, you have to realize a contemplative life is not simply to achieve a state of mental bliss. It's actually to transform you within, and sometimes that's a painful experience. In fact, very often it is. In the Christian life, we go to confession. Okay, why do we go to confession? Because we keep finding stuff that we need to confess. All right, that's good for us because we're bringing it out into the light, like Jesus said in John 3. You're bringing it into the light, and when it's in the light, it can be healed. It can be dealt with. So, so how do I deal with that? You learn to become more and more patient, and the key is humility. It is in being humble, recognizing that I'm not, I haven't arrived. I'm not a saint. I'm in need of constant mercy. So that forces me to stay in prayer. That forces me to continue in the spiritual warfare, if you will, and also to love others who are in the same struggle. You see, so you become more and more patient, God willing, with others. Because they're also wrestling with the world and the flesh, the devil, and all that.
Now, what you say makes me think of two quotes. Let's say one is Mahatma Gandhi. One said, "God to be God must rule the heart and transform it." I think you're quite right. Most people, when they get into contemplative practices, whether it's Zen or some others, they try to arrive at this blissful state of mind, but that's not the point. The whole point is about getting transformed. And so the other thing I was thinking about is the title of that famous book, which is a contemplative book as well. The practice of the presence of God. And somebody like B.D. Griffiths would often, when he defines contemplative life itself, that's what he uses, that terminology, the practice of the presence of God. Right. And so it's a practice of a constant feeling of the presence of God, but it is a practice, and that's what you mean with the asceticism. And so, considering it's a practice, I'm really wondering, how do you implement some of the contemplative practices in your life? How do you make that concrete?